Next presenter is Ms. Shelley Maniscalco. And Shelley is a registered dietitian who has been practicing nutrition and dietetics in the Washington, D.C. area
can you
for
hear me?
more than 2 decades. Yes, Shelley, can you hear me now?
Linda, can you hear me?
Let's see. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, great. Okay. I can't hear you, just so you know.
Oh, okay. Let me just finish introducing you, and then we'll kick it over to you.
I see your lips moving, but I cannot hear you, which is going to be a big issue in the Q&A.
Okay, well, why don't you get started?
Okay, I'll just go ahead. So thank you for having me today. I am tasked with following Dr. Brenna, which thank you so much. You provided a tremendous amount of context for what I am going to present, which is taking that DGAC report and translating that into federal policy and then finally into programming. Just so you know, just a little bit of context, I am prepared to offer you what I think is a unique perspective into this process because I've been outside, inside, and then outside again. So I would say you could describe me as a DGA junkie, perhaps, where I was closely monitoring the guidelines process and content in 2000 and 2005. In 2010, I was actually in USDA as part of the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion team. I was on the team that was creating My Plate and leading up the partnership program. And then in 2015, I led up all the dietary guidelines communications. So now in 2020, which I can't even believe it's 2020, I'm back on the outside, but this time with a little bit of a different lens of how things work on the inside. And that's what I'll share with you today. So I'm going to come at this from the 3 biggest bucket areas. One is the science, which is the first step, 2, the policy development, and then 3, what we're all waiting for, which is the implementation and dissemination that spans all the way to the next dietary guidelines edition. So I don't even need to talk about this because Dr. Brenna did such a great job of talking about the advisory committee process and what they found in relation to seafood. But just know that this is, as he mentioned, this part is behind us, and now we are very much looking forward to the policy development. And I know for a fact that my USDA colleagues are working feverishly, even as we speak, to get this all done. A couple of observations given the progression of the guidelines. As Dr. Brenna pointed out, they evolve every time, and they evolve to respond to external feedback, to scientific enhancements, but they evolve. And so these are, from my perspective, this is the greatest transparent and an open process that we've had yet. I know that the staff inside is dedicated and committed to continually updating the process in a way to make it more so. But we saw in the 2020-25 process, we saw greater transparency in the schedule, certainly, the identification of topics and questions up front. So we knew what they were going to be covering, and then we're actually able to reply to that and provide comment into that to impact what those questions are. The comment period spanned the entire process, which is new. And I don't know if you noticed, maybe you did, that the website was way more helpful in terms of having all the information there, all the questions that were being asked, where the subcommittees were in answering that question, and then sharing the NESR protocols and the conclusion statements when they were available. And then finally, a new step of having ARS, which is another research agency within USDA, do a peer review of all the systematic reviews before the committee report is final. So you're looking at this slide and you're thinking, these are the criteria that were used to develop topic areas and scientific questions for the advisory committee, which is, in our rearview mirror. Why is she talking about this now? Well, the reason is that these were the criteria that the government used to say which questions and which areas were going to be covered this time. And I'd love to just put this back on the higher up on your radar as criteria to consider when the government's going to be responsible for translating that scientific report to the policy. And one more note before I go into the policy development, there's always been a lot of confusion about who does what, and as Dr. Brenna mentioned, this is definitely the most robust Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee process yet, and certainly the most robust federal staff dedicated to it yet. And so I wanted to just take a moment to point out the roles and responsibilities and essentially the division of responsibility among the staff versus the committee members. So the staff do not drive the process. The staff facilitate the process. So the committee members, they come up with the protocols and the exclusion criteria, and that goes to the federal staff who generate the NESA reviews, who actually carry those out and do all the legwork, providing the data to the committee to make decisions. They generate the surveillance and food pattern modeling data from the federal databases. They monitor the subgroup calls and take notes. But all of the decisions are made by the committee. The committee, not just in their subgroups, but then as a bigger body, made the decisions jointly on what to include in that report, and then they were responsible for writing and reviewing those chapters before it went to the department. So what you've been waiting for, the policy development. This gives you an idea of what the policy looked like, since back in the day, in the 80s, when we started this process. You can kind of see by this picture that the first dietary guidelines, the first several, were really brochures. They were sort of an amalgamation between information for health professionals implementing the policy to consumers on the outside, but then including the consumer messages. And like I said, they were very thin. They were very top line. As we've gone on in this process and it's become more rigorous, so have the dietary guidelines policy documents. And this one, the last one that we've seen, 2015, 2020, it's a booklet that has recommendations and substantiation and appendices and charts galore. And that's what we can expect to see this time around as well. So the writing process, if you've ever worked in the government, you know that there is, in fact, a process for everything, and this is no different. There are guidelines that have been shared in terms of how the writing process is, and how the federal experts who are on the writing team are going to be doing their work. So the first is it's their responsibility to represent the totality of the evidence. So looking at what the scientific justification is, how strong the conclusions that were made by the committee are, and how to kind of pull that all together. They are, if you remember back to the criteria, they are on the hook to address the needs of federal programs. So they will be working with the agencies and the programs to make sure that they have what they need. The writing group is comprised of federal experts. Mostly it's scientists, but there are communication specialists who are involved in various aspects of the process to make sure that that it makes sense to other audiences, and not just using government jargon. To mitigate unintended consequences. So one of my previous colleagues, who's now retired, but she was a mainstay in the dietary guidelines process for years and years and years, she would always remind us that the devil's in the details. And that's really what this is. So the government is not only looking at making sure that they're promoting health, but also thinking about what intended consequences could potentially come about based on what they're putting in that document, and then trying to sidestep those. Fifth, following best practices for developing guidelines. That includes managing conflicts of interest and having stakeholders weigh in and being clear and concise, and all of these that we know, but these are tenets that they are considering every day. And then incorporating plain language strategies to minimize jargon, to have graphic elements that make the guidance more understandable. And then the writing process, this is basically how it goes. So the writing team gets together as a group where they look at the previous DGA edition. They talk about the scientific report, what may need to change, what may not be needing to change, and looking at public and agency comments. The second is they roll up their sleeves and start writing. And so there are writing assignments, there's a lead and typically a backup. They draft their chapters within a certain time. They pass them around across review and make sure that they are being complementary and not contradictory or even redundant. The drafts are also reviewed by a science editor and communication specialist, looking more broadly at how the document fits together and whether it's clear and whether it's comprehensive. Then different federal subject matter experts may be consulted. These could be program staff within, SNAP or WIC or something like that, to see what they need and whether they have the information included that help them do their job. And then it's review. There's lots of reviews to ensure that consensus has been reached and that the document is the way that it needs to be before it's designed. But that's not all. Then there's the review process, which is very significant and rigorous. It actually starts with a federal expert technical review, which goes beyond the writing team. So it's pretty big. It involves what's estimated to be more than 100 federal experts, and it goes through all the different agencies within USDA and HHS that actually have a stake in nutrition. So, so NIH is going to be looking at this differently than FDA, and FDA is going to be looking at this differently than CDC, and CDC is going to be looking different than FSIS. So they're all looking at the document from their different lenses. From that point, it goes to external peer review, because you need external feedback as well. And this can include members from previous advisory committees, policy advisors. It's again rather comprehensive. And then only after those two have been done does it start moving up the chain. So it starts with agency clearance and going to each of these agencies that I've discussed. And then, obviously this differs administration by administration, but this is basically how it goes. It goes to all the major, it goes to the agencies, and then it goes to the interim departmental offices, and they clear it for the secretaries. And then the last step in the process are the secretary sign off. And then at that time, the dietary guidelines are able to be released. So, which is my favorite part as a communications person. This is my crystal ball that I mean, if you think through this guideline process, it has undergone a government shutdown, a pandemic, a lot. It had a delay. It's they're responding to the NASEM report that had some feedback into the process and how to improve it. So there's been a lot to kind of push this back. So I would predict that the policy document is likely going to be released by the secretaries at right under the wire in 2020. They're actually it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes things happen, but they're required by law to get them out every 5 years, and that would be by the end of 2020. Then I think that all the attention will go to it after the New Year's. I know that the government is planning a big promotion around New Year's and My Plate using technology as a centerpiece. And then that's when the programs will really be thinking about how to update their materials and their policy in accordance. And which brings me to the third step, which is implementation and ongoing dissemination. So something to think about when you look at the policy and what's included in it. Everything that's included in it is not only helpful for health professionals, but also provides the context needed for various aspects of the feeding programs and others to do their job. So the policy is going to feature recommendations. So this is a recommendation from 2015 about protein intake, including seafood. And, you know, it's a big recommendation that like really gets to the dietary patterns, including some limits on nutrients of concern and some like actual quantification. But that is not really, it's not specific enough for some of the programs to be able to update their policy and execute their policy. And so that's why we see that the policy features food patterns to guide those programs. And this is where, you know, they have very specific calorie levels. They have calorie levels for children, calorie levels for older adults. And then for each of those calorie levels, they have recommended intakes of food groups. And they get very specific so that those different programs can take the data that is specific to their audiences and make them come alive in the policy. And just a differentiation, just to kind of show you how this actually plays out in real life. So the very specific policy, that's what SNAP and WIC are going to use to say, okay, what foods are covered, what money is needed to help the participants fund those foods. School and out of school feeding programs and adult feeding programs, Indian reservations guides what the policy is for them as well at a very micro level. And then the implementation is where the recommendations are taken, and those specialists essentially within those programs are able to take those recommendations and to frame them for their different participants, whether that's SNAP educators, SNAP participants, WIC educators, WIC participants, school for food service directors, students. So there's a lot of different levels, and having this detailed dietary guidelines policy document helps to facilitate all of that. These are just a couple of examples of dietary guidelines in action. And these are, I was asked to look at the USDA feeding program. So these are all the USDA related programs, but obviously the scope goes way bigger than that, and there's a lot of ripple effect, which is why we're all so interested in it. So with that, I'm going to get out of my presentation so that I can see you all again and